Good evening, everybody. It's good to see you came back again. This is going to be a very difficult lecture for me because this is something that I'm deep into. See, I just have a passing fancy for dinosaurs and paleontology. That was kind of fun. But this is literally my life. 2 weeks ago on Monday, I tapped into a brand new data source, and I have been studying literally morning, noon, and night, dreaming about it, waking up early, staying up late, doing numbers. And it is really hard to come up from that and show you what I've learned. But what I've been doing for more than 10 years now is analyzing evolutionary data sets and trying to see what they tell me. And it turns out when you just look at them, they're screaming Adam and Eve. And they're not supposed to. They're supposed to be telling us about out of Africa and chimpanzees and monkeys, right? But they don't. They highly suggest a biblical picture. I'm going to try to lay that out for you. Let's see if we can get the finger signal going here. There we go. I assume a few of you weren't here this morning, so welcome. It's good to meet you. Glad you came. I work for an organization called Ministries International. Now we are over 40 years old. We're headquartered in Brisbane, Australia. We have 7 offices around the world in English-speaking countries, and our U.S. office is right here in Powder Springs. So it was an easy drive for me to get here this morning. We produce Creation Magazine. We've been doing this for, a long time now, decades. This now goes out to, I think, 110 different countries. In fact, even though we own Creation.com, which is a very important piece of real estate on the internet, we still know that more people read our magazine than go to our website. And this is a very important website. We've got a pretty high ranking, and yet the magazine reaches more people. That's amazing. Old technology, but old technology still is pretty good. So I would hope you would invest in some of this as we learn more about what we're going to learn about. Now, if you're new to this and you would like some information, how come that didn't come up? Try one more. There we go. If you would like more information on this topic, or if you'd like to stay up to date on this information, we're going to, just like this morning, we're going to hand around a sign-up form for our email newsletter. If you didn't see it before, here's an opportunity. And if you've seen this and you don't want it, whatever, just pass it along. And eventually it'll get to everyone, so just keep on passing them back. Okay. Those can go around now, guys. Thank you. And that's what it looks like. Sorry, I'm trying to get to the meat of it. I want to introduce you to a very important person. This is Dr. Francis Collins. If you would look around the world in science, and I know scientists don't have ranks like sergeant, major, general, but if you were to look in the world of science for the highest ranking Christian, you would not find one at a higher academic level than Dr. Francis Collins. He ran the Human Genome Project. That man spent $3 billion. Right now, he's the director of the National Institutes of Health, which budgets much more than $3 billion per year. He claims to be an evangelical Christian, and I would not dare to doubt the man's faith. That would never be my purpose. However, he was foundational in the organization of a group called BioLogos. And that group, initially, their stated objective, one of them, was to contradict this young earth creationism stuff. Well, that's really curious, because you know the old adage, with friends like that, who needs... So here's a person who has positioned himself directly against CMI's position, argues against us, using some pretty bad arguments usually. But let me just give you an introduction into the flavor of what we're talking about. This is a quote from an article that appeared in Christianity Today. You all familiar with that magazine? Just a couple years ago, it said, Collins' 2006 bestseller, The Language of God, a scientist presents evidence for belief. Yeah. They're about to present a scientist's evidence for belief. What do you think a Christian's evidence for belief should be? What do you think it would be? What about science, though? In science, what do you think? What kind of evidence would you like to support your belief? Well, he reported scientific indications that anatomically modern humans emerged from primate ancestors perhaps 100,000 years ago. Long before the Genesis time frame, and originated with a population that numbers something like 10,000, not 2 individuals. Where do these numbers come from? Why those? What is that? That's called the out of Africa theory. The out of Africa theory, the evolutionists think that we came from a very small population, only about 100,000 or fewer, actually 10,000 is the actual number they usually quote. And a few hundred thousand years ago, a few tens of thousands of people lived in Africa, and that's where Homo sapiens evolved. So his scientist evidence for belief is 100% orthodox evolutionary theory. And I'm very confused at this point. Because where does the belief start? And they keep going. In a recent pro-evolution book from InterVarsity Press, The Language of Science and Faith, Collins and co-author Carl W. Giberson, now Giberson, he was a professor at a Christian college, he just retired. They escalate matters, announcing that, unfortunately, the concepts of Adam and Eve as a literal first couple and the ancestors of all humans simply do not fit the evidence. All right, Christian, are you intimidated at this point? Do you have the ability to walk up to someone like Dr. Francis Collins and say, Dr. Collins, you're wrong, and here's why? Could you do that? If there's anyone in the world who understands the human genome, who should that person be? Yeah, Francis Collins. So when this person makes a pronouncement based on his faith that evolution is true, that's a very persuasive argument for many people, is it not? Yeah. So what I'm doing, I'm trying to set up a problem here. We're going to take apart this problem, one piece at a time. But let it be known that some very significant Christians absolutely agree with evolutionary theory. And sadly, they never actually seem to ask what creation theory would predict. So the rest of this lecture, I'm going to tell you what creation theory would predict, and I'm going to show you how it matches the human genome. And I'm going to show you how some evolutionary theory, what it predicts, does not. But first, a quote from an atheist, Frank Zindler. He said this in a debate with William Lane Craig. Now, you know who Bill Craig is, right? William Lane Craig. He's got a ministry right here in Atlanta. He's a Christian apologist, very famous. I mean, I've watched some of his stuff, read some of his stuff. He's actually blessed me with some of his materials, but he also believes the earth is millions of years old. And in the middle of this debate, this is what Zindler, the atheist, said. He said, the most devastating thing that biology did to Christianity was a discovery of biological evolution. Now that we know that Adam and Eve never were real people, the central myth of Christianity is destroyed. What's the central myth of Christianity? If there never was an Adam and Eve, there never was an original sin. Now, Baptists, they don't tend to say original sin. That's a very Catholic sounding phrase, but it's the idea of a fall in the garden, the original sin. If there never was an original sin, there's no need of salvation. If there's no need of salvation, there's no need of a Savior. And I submit that puts Jesus, historical or otherwise, into the ranks of the unemployed. I think that evolution is absolutely the death knell of Christianity. Now, I could have used any number of quotes from evolutionists going all the way back to the time of Charles Darwin, who understood this formula. Charles Darwin and his friends knew that if you get rid of the first atom, you get rid of the last atom. They knew this quite well, and that's why Darwin did not talk about the creation or origin of mankind and the origin of species. He waited 12 years, let evolution filter, and then he published a work called The Descent of Man, in which he claimed that man evolved from monkeys. He's actually a very smart strategist. He was very adept at milking public opinion, massaging public opinion, and then slipping the poison pill in later. Brilliant work. But he knew that if Adam wasn't true, there's no reason for Jesus. Think about this. If evolution is true, evolution in a broad sense, Big Bang, origin of life, origin of species, if evolution in the broad sense is true, there is absolutely no need for God. From the Big Bang until today, God is absolutely irrelevant. Now, I do not believe that pure materialistic science can explain the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of species, the origin of people, the origin of higher consciousness, multicellularity, sexual reproduction, all these crazy complicated things that would never come from the natural world. But if evolution can explain them, there's no room for God. That's a powerful stuff. So our quest then is to determine Were Adam and Eve real people? Did they really exist? Is the biblical account of creation real history? Or maybe Adam and Eve are some early expression of the Hebrew mythos. Because, a lot of professors will teach that the Hebrews, they're not Hebrews, they're actually a Canaanite tribe that was living up in the hill country of what would later be called Israel, and they invented history for themselves. They just invented it, made it up, and that's what they're teaching is the book of Genesis. And those are some big questions. So let's see if Adam and Eve are real or mythological. First, though, we have to get into the Bible. And we got to look at the Bible, and if we just take it at face value, the Bible claims to be the history book of the universe. It claims to explain everything and where it all came from. That's a big proposition. So it's going to either be true or false. And here's the scary part. Sorry, I was using my fingers. I should not use my fingers when God's looking for my finger pointing. True or false. And the scary thing is that genetics, the science of genetics, was designed to test theories of history. The study of genetics is how traits are passed from one generation to the next. That's called time. And if you reverse the process, that's called history. So we have genetic tools that we can use to test theories of history. Oh, this is scary. That means we can test the Bible. Do we dare? Well, yeah, we're going to dare. But we're going to do it very carefully, understanding that most of what we think is true in science probably isn't. Understood? Because most of what you were taught when you were young is no longer true. Most of what these kids are being taught is not going to be true 20, 30, 40 years from now. Oh, well, that was wrong. And that's most of it. That's really amazing stuff. But we can test it. But let's just take the Bible at face value. The Bible claims the whole universe was created over a 6-day time frame, a little more than 6,000 years ago. It also claims that we started with one man and one woman. The Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living creature. Let's pause there for a second. What, according to the Bible, is the difference between man and monkeys? Does the Bible say anything about genetics? Genetic diversity? Does the Bible say that humans and chimpanzees should be radically different on the inside? It doesn't say that at all. In fact, we're not radically different on the outside. Out of all the species out there, chimpanzees are closer to us than a rutabaga, right? Well, they're closer to us than marmosets. They're the closest species to us. Even if they didn't exist, there would still be a closer species. And if monkeys didn't exist, they'd, look at bears. Bears and humans are very similar. That's true. So in one sense, if you look at us morphologically, chimpanzees kind of look like us. They do act like us in some ways. They eat all the same foods that we do. And we invented clothing and air conditioning, which is why we got out of the tropics. But if we weren't smart enough to do that, we would still be living next to them in the rainforest. Because we're naked. And it gets cold in the wintertime. But if they have all the same physiological requirements we do, I would directly predict they would have very similar genes to us. Oh. So both the creation and the evolutionists predict that chimpanzees would be more similar to us genetically. Know where I come from? Therefore, genetic similarity is not an argument. Pardon me. Okay, what is the argument? What is the difference between chimpanzees and humans, biblically? Yes. Up to this point in creation week, God spoke everything into existence. Let there be, let it come, let the earth produce. But here, God stops, He manufactures Adam out of the dust of the ground and breathes into his nostrils the breath of life. What separates us is our ability to relate to our Creator through the Spirit. Chimpanzees are spiritually dead. They have no concept of the things that we have. If you give a chimpanzee a choice between white noise and Mozart, he'll choose one of them 50% of the time. Totally randomly. They will never compose poetry. They will never make fire. They will never fly to the moon. Here's a puzzle. I hear some people say, hey, if evolution is true, how come there's still monkeys? That's a bad question. A very bad question. In fact, that's on our list of arguments we think a creationist should not use. A better question is this. If humans came from a common ancestor with chimpanzees 6 million years ago, how come they're still so stupid? They've had the same amount of time, the same amount of natural selection, the same number of mutations, the same number of generations, the same environmental changes. What made us fly to the moon and they essentially are identical to the common ancestor? They've advanced nowhere. In fact, elephants are smarter. Crows are smarter. That's a big puzzle. Humans are an evolutionary mystery. But after God creates Adam, notice that Adam was without a helpmeet, so God caused a deep sleep to fall on the man. And while he slept, he took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh. And the rib the Lord had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. Interestingly, the rib, the lower rib, is the one bone in the body that if you remove it, it will regrow. Did you know that? Our founding director, Dr. Carl Wieland, who's now happily retired, he did not know this, and he was a medical doctor. He's a family practitioner. He was in a horrible car accident in the outback of Australia. Basically, he fell asleep at the wheel driving through the middle of nowhere and crossed over the line at the one time in 100 miles where a truck was coming the other direction. His right leg is about that much shorter than his left leg. He has no right eye. He had no face. He had 30 surgeries to reconstruct himself. And the third time he's being wheeled into the operating room, knowing they're going to take a piece of his rib and use that bone to put his face back together, he made a joke to the doctor, there must not be much of that rib left. And the doctor looked down and says, don't you know we take the whole thing out every time? Cool. One bone that does regrow. And there it is right there. So therefore, the question, do men have one less rib than women? No. Duh. And yet, that still, people think that just by reading the Bible, because it kind of says it. But come on. If you lose your finger, how many fingers do your children have? Of course, Adam, even if he had lost his rib entirely, his children would not have been born, or men would not have been born with one less rib. Okay. Well, we got to treat this carefully. And the reason we have to treat this carefully, as illustrated this morning, is the way the New Testament deals with this stuff. I mean, Mark here, Mark chapter 10, the words of Jesus. When Jesus says, but from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. You see little quote marks in there? God made them male and female. That's a direct quote from Genesis chapter 1. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother. That comes from Genesis chapter 2. Now, remember before I said that the college professor was teaching that early Hebrews made up their own history? They're teaching also that they grabbed creation stories from different cultures and stuck them together. That's why there's more than one creation account in Genesis. Genesis 1 is one creation account. Genesis 2 and 3 are a totally different creation account. You know that's not true, right? And one reason we know it's not true, because Jesus is quoting from both of them in the same sentence. Or at least same breath, at least. That's cool. By the way, how do you explain the different creation account thing? Well, it's actually kind of easy. See, Genesis chapter 1 is talking about the creation of the entire universe. Genesis chapter 2 and 3 is everything Adam could have seen. Literally, after Adam is created, it's life in the garden. A very specific, it's just homing in on a very specific series of events on a very small plot of ground in a very small window of universal history. Of course they're different. They're telling different details of the same story. Now, we're going to get to genetics. We're going to talk about the most complex molecule in the universe. The impossible molecule. Because geneticists for many years refused to believe that this molecule could convey information. It's an acid. It's a long, sticky string. It's incredibly fragile. It's just 4 letters, A, T, G, and C, and a line. What is that? Proteins are the complicated molecules. Proteins are crazy. There's lots of information in proteins. There's no information in that string. Oh, but they were so wrong. And it took decades for that old idea to get knocked away. It finally happened when Watson and Crick figured out the shape of that molecule. Now, to show you that this is my field, I showed you this earlier. This is my animals that I was working in. And these are my animals that I took the genes from one animal, put it into bacteria, took it out of bacteria, put it into the second animal. I am a geneticist by training. I don't do this type of genetics anymore. I'm kind of a data nerd now. And so what I do is I publish papers on genetic data. Here's a paper I published. It's in an evolutionary journal. Why can't a creationist publish an evolutionary journal? All I did was I took data from a government database, I analyzed it, and I published a paper on my findings. Because you see, you've heard the phrase mitochondrial Eve. You ever heard that phrase? The one mother of all people alive today? Well, evolution's been talking about it for a decade, but no one had ever actually calculated what that sequence was. So I went ahead and calculated it. I published it for the evolutionists just because they needed to know. Here's another paper. It's on the flu virus. You remember that? Remember the H1N1 scare of 2009, 2010, the swine flu? Remember how many people died? Yeah, hardly any. It was a complete nothing. And so after that, we started a study on, my friend John Sanford and I wrote an important book on the tables there. We studied the influenza genome, and we were the people that realized that human H1N1 went extinct in 2009. The evolutionists didn't notice, so we published it for them. But that flu that killed so many people right after World War I, 1917, it swept across the world and had been in the world ever since, getting weaker and weaker and weaker. See, the evolutionists are afraid of the new flu virus that might evolve and wipe us all out. But when you actually look at the virus, you see them get less and less robust. And that is an idea called genetic entropy. A very profound idea invented by creationists that says, yes, natural selection is true. Yes, mutations are true. But natural selection can't remove most mutations. Therefore, all species are doomed to extinction. And this is the first time we actually saw that work out in real life. That's actually a pretty important paper. So that's me, that's my life. Now, I've already used the word genome. And I imagine that most people in the room have no idea what that means. So let me give you a picture of one. That is a genome. That could be you. Now, if you're a girl, it can't be you because that's a man's genome. I know that because all these things called chromosomes come in pairs. But the last two on the bottom right are not paired. It's a Y and an X. The Y chromosome is what makes men men. Now I remember Georgia Tech being very authoritatively taught the Y chromosome is a shriveled up piece of vestigial junk DNA. It doesn't hardly do. There's hardly any genes on it. One day it'll be completely eliminated from the population because males are superfluous. That kind of nonsense talking. But see, that was before the human genome was decoded. Now we know the Y chromosome, even though it doesn't have many genes, those genes are a master control switch that affect the expression of thousands of genes on all of the other chromosomes. It's very, very important. And it's profound. Think about it. Are men and women the same? We don't look the same, we don't act the same, and we certainly don't think the same. If any of you are married, you would now know that. That little piece of DNA has that profound difference. Now, your genome is just like an encyclopedia. Now, you young people probably never seen an encyclopedia. Maybe you went to that dusty old place called the library. You might have noticed on one shelf this big old series of books. It's like the knowledge of everything. Well, an encyclopedia for all you old folks, I used to have one in our basement. I never even opened it. And now, I got it right here. So who needs it anymore? But in the old days, I had this series of books called an encyclopedia. And it was, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, everything in the world, all the way down to zebras. Well, your genome is just like an encyclopedia. This DNA string is written out in 3 billion letters in 23 books called chromosomes. But remember when they used to launch a space shuttle? Did you know that every critical component on the space shuttle, well, except for the booster seal, that was an accident, but every critical component on the space shuttle, there were 3 of. So the flight computer, there were 3 of them. They had the main one, and then a backup, and then a backup to the backup. Why? It's called redundancy. Redundancy in engineering is called being smart. That is redundancy. This is a great engineering principle built right into the genome. In fact, if you didn't have 2 copies of your genome, you'd be dead. Because you're missing about 1 million letters. You have entire genes that are necessary for survival that you don't have in the copy you got from Dad. But maybe the copy you got from Mom carries that little piece, and that's why you're alive. Complex life like humans could not exist if we didn't have 2 copies of the genome. That's cool. Oh, wait, don't go. Don't. Okay. The most important part of this picture are those 2 little ones, the Y there. That's the thing that men pass on to their sons. And if you look around the world, you can actually build a family tree of all the men in the world. Well, we can also have a little piece of DNA that we can use to build a family tree of all the women in the world. It's called a mitochondrial DNA. It's an mtDNA, thing off to the side there. See, this is a cell. Here's a nucleus with all your DNA. Outside the nucleus are these little teeny things called mitochondria. Those are the things that convert sugar into energy. Now, I apparently have too many of them, but whatever. They convert sugar into energy, and they carry a little teeny piece of DNA all by themselves. It's only 16,000 letters long, but according to a lot of experimentation, you only get it from your mother. So we can build a family tree of all the females in the world. Now, you have already figured out that I am a nerd. I wear that badge proudly. My favorite subjects in the world: genetics, history, geography, and genealogy. Now give me those subjects and give me Google Earth, and what am I going to do? Of course, I'm going to draw lines on the earth from where my ancestors were born to where their children are born. Boom, 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 boom. That's where my ancestors, all those lines are one of my ancestors jumping the pond, coming to America. Look at me. What part of the world do I come from? It's pretty obvious, isn't it? I'm a Northern European. How can we do that? I'll get to that in a second. Question, where the races come from? Oh, I'm getting to it. But looking at that, this is my heritage. My ancestors are from Germany, Norway, Holland, Ireland, and England. That's me. But where did my Y chromosome come from? My father's 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 father came from there. Ireland. But Carter is not an Irish name. That's an English name. Am I one of those English jerks that dominated Ireland for many, many years? Or am I MacArthur who changed her name to Carter to get along better with the English? That's an open question. I don't know the answer to that. All I know is my ancestors came over here from Northern Ireland in the middle of the Irish potato famine. Well, I had one of my, I submitted my test, I signed up for 23andme.com. I had my DNA looked at. Turns out my Y chromosome is found in about 3 million Irish men from Northern Ireland. I am a Celt. So I am probably originally a MacArthur. Interesting. You can do all sorts of cool stuff about history and this stuff. But if we twist this around and look at where my mother's 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 mother, Ringsjet Everts van der Vliet, she came from Frisia, Northern Holland. She was a Viking. But those are the people that became the English that then went over to Ireland and caused problems in Ireland for all those centuries. You know, I'm a man who hates himself. But it doesn't matter where you come from in the world, your ancestors fought each other. Because people are mean. And throughout world history, people have done really bad things to their neighbors. Well, this is called sin. So I broached a question a second ago. Where do the races come from? How do we explain it? Or even better, if we started with Adam and Eve, how do we get races? Or what would Adam and Eve have looked like? Okay, you Europeans, I'm going to shock you. You're a pile of mutants. Okay, just make people mad. Let me prove it. Ready? If blue eyes are only found in Scandinavia and in places where the Vikings conquered in the Middle Ages, which is true, then blue eyes originated in the Viking population. That means that's a mutation formed in one small population way after the Tower of Babel. Genes that are spread all around the world were probably at Babel, therefore they're on the ark, therefore God probably put that gene into Adam himself. But genes that are only found in a small group of people are statistically not likely to have been at Babel, on the Ark, or in Adam. Red hair, Scotland and Ireland. Light skin, Europe. The Asians have a different light skin caused by a similar mutation in the same gene on chromosome 16. What is this? This is a mutation that allowed my ancestors to survive in Europe at the end of the Ice Age, where if you had dark skin, you weren't getting enough vitamin D, and you were getting rickets and had very low rates of childbirth. But the light skin gene here allows me to produce a lot of vitamin D with a very short sun exposure. This is a survival mechanism. The question isn't where black people came from. The question is, where did white people come from? And we can now answer that. Oh, there's more. There's more. There's some fun stuff coming up. Okay, but let's just take this Bible idea, right? We start with Adam and Eve. 2 people. How much genetic diversity can 2 people hold? Not much. But the Bible also predicts that we all would come from one male ancestor. See, if evolution is true, we have a common ancestor with chimpanzees, there might be multiple lineages of Y chromosomes that are found in chimpanzees and humans that we all inherited from this population of ancestors. Turns out, that's not true. The human Y chromosome is very similar all around the world, and it's radically different than the chimpanzee genome, the chimpanzee Y chromosome. It's way different. It's so different you can't account for those number of changes in only 6 million years. That's funny. There's also this idea of this one mitochondrial, one female ancestor in the Bible. Well, it turns out there is only one female ancestor. In fact, these predictions absolutely predict what modern genetics has discovered. They have discovered that humans from one end of this planet to the other are very similar. They've discovered that men are incredibly similar. Yes, women, we really are all alike. Well, guess what, guys? There really is only one woman. And all the women in the world are descended from a recent common ancestor named Eve. And genetics is telling us that. Okay. This is a picture of the human genome. 2 copies of the same chromosome. I changed a couple of letters, though. And the letters I changed, I've made them blue versus red. This might be like the chromosome number 1 you got from your mother versus the chromosome 1 you got from your father. Most of the diversity within you is just 1 letter here versus 1 letter here. This might be an A, that might be a T. This might be a G, this might be a C. That's what we're looking at. That's most of the diversity. What does that mean? If you look at the 2 sets of genomes that you got from your parents, on average, there's 3 million places where they don't agree. So there's 3 million points where your mother and father disagreed with one another, and you inherited those points. But ready to see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now I imagine you people are not related biologically, right? You 4 and you 2, right? No brother, sister here? Okay. These 6 people have 99% of the world's genetic diversity. And I just picked 4 white people. 99% of the world is sitting there. If I add up 8 or 10 people, I've got almost all the diversity in the entire world. What's missing? If I'm only picking Europeans, I'm not going to grab sickle cell anemia, which originated in Africa. If I only pick people from Africa, I'm not going to get blue eyes. But you know the difference between blue eyes and brown eyes? 1 letter. The difference between light skin and dark skin? 1 letter. What's 1 divided by 3 billion letters? A very small fraction. That's how much separates white people from black people. It's called 0. Let's explain it this way. Imagine that blue circle is all the variation of all the people in the world. Now let's add some people to this. There's a person coming up. Come on, person. Oh, it didn't work. All right, never mind. We'll skip that one. Let's go to the next point in the Bible that talks about genetics. Now, the sons of Noah who went forth from the ark. Remember, the Bible says that all people descended from people who were on board the ark, right? There's only 8 people on the ark. Can all of humanity originate from 8 people? Actually, it seems better than that. only 6 of those people are the ancestors of everybody. Because there were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These 3 were the sons of Noah, and from these, the people of the whole earth were dispersed. So Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their 3 wives, the Bible claims all people in the world came from 3 couples. Can that possibly be true? Yes, it can. Let's ask it this way, though. How many Y chromosomes were on board Noah's Ark? 1. Most people say 4. Because there were 4 men. But all 3 of the brothers inherited the same Y chromosome from their father. There could have been a mutation between father and son, which is kind of likely because, Noah's more than 500 years old when he has his children. Let me say something else, a little aside here. Women are generally afraid of having children after the age of 40. Why? Because of Down syndrome. Because Down syndrome rates go higher after the age of 40. That causes most women to think that they're the source of mutations. But it's actually not true. Almost all mutations come from the male. Because you see, when a woman is pregnant with a little girl, the ovaries are finished after only 20 cell divisions. And the eggs are held in the ovary in protective custody for sometimes more than 40 years before ovulation. That is a wonderful design, because every time the cell divides, those little machines that copy DNA make mistakes. So the more cell divisions you have, the more mutations you would have. It's a good thing that children aren't born from skin cells. 2 years from now, I'm going to be 50. It is estimated that at 50 years old, the average person has 60,000 mutations in every one of their skin cells. That's not good. That means we are actually mutating ourselves to death. And mutations it will kill all of us eventually. If we don't get eaten by a bear but get hit by a bus, you're going to die of mutation accumulation. It's called the curse. This is how it works out. Okay, going back to here though. What was I saying? Wait. Essentially, 1 Y chromosome. But because Noah was so old, he could potentially have passed a lot of mutations to his children. How many mitochondrial DNAs were there? Well, I suspect 1 from Eve, but because we have 1,500 or 1,600 years between Eve and the girls on board the ark, and I have no idea how many generations of females that is. It's at least 10, that's how many males. It could be 20 for some, I don't know. It's a lot of generations. We could have a lot of mutations happening in those generations. So we might have up to 3 different lineages of mitochondria. Now, if Noah's wife has a daughter after the flood, okay, twist my arm, maybe there's going to be 4 mitochondria in the world. But if some of those girls are sisters, or if all 3 of them are sisters, there might only be 1 mitochondria in the world. Now, in the evolutionary story, we could have thousands. It turns out, we don't. There's only 1. They call her mitochondrial Eve. There's only 1 Y chromosome. He's called Y chromosome Adam. Now, the evolutionists gave them those names to mock the Bible. And for a long time, Adam and Eve never even knew each other. One lived 300,000 years ago. One lived 200,000 years ago. Ha ha ha. Oh, actually, that's not true anymore, because now they've revised the numbers, and their mitochondrial Eve and their Y chromosome Adam live at approximately the same time now. That's a very interesting factor. Last part. Are you getting tired? Everyone do this. Okay. Genesis chapter 11, the Tower of Babel, is our last part of the Bible that talks about genetics. That's not true, but the last part we're going to talk about talks about genetics. Now, the whole earth had 1 language and 1 speech, and they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city, a tower as tops in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." Does the Bible there say that all the people were staying together on purpose? Does it say there was 1 language, 1 culture? Would you expect in that scenario that the sons of Shem would marry the daughters of Ham? This is important, because when God separates the nations at the Tower of Babel, he does it according to Y chromosome, not according to mitochondrial DNA. You see, God told people to spread out, and they refused. And when that happened, God said, Come, let us go down and confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So Lord, scatter them abroad from there over the face of the earth. They cease building the city. Essentially, God said this. Oh, that's my next slide. Look at this picture here. This is called the out of Africa account of human origins. Now, ignore the starting point, which is way down in southern Africa. That's actually, no one believes that people evolved in southern Africa. They think we evolved in Ethiopia, which is right next to the Middle East. And that's uncomfortable, so they tend to draw these maps with a starting point way far away from the Middle East. Why? Because once they leave Africa, the evolution is telling us that a small band of people spread out across the entire world with one main Y chromosome and one main mitochondrial lineage, and small people groups into uninhabited territory, and even for the evolutionists, in the recent past. Oh, and by the way, they went through the Middle East. Every one of those is a direct prediction of the Tower of Babel account. They've discovered the Tower of Babel. Now, why do they have that origin in Africa? I think there's some latent European racism in this, because Charles Darwin certainly believed that black people were closer to monkeys than the Europeans were. Absolutely, and he wrote about it. It's horrible to read about it. He was totally wrong. But it's very convenient for the European geneticists to put the origin down there. First of all, it gets the Bible out of the picture. Second of all, it makes them feel better about themselves. Because really, the opposite is true. The Europeans are the mutants, as we're about to see. But this is the Tower of Babel account. Boom! And God spreads people across the whole world. And there's one time in history where you could have walked from the Middle East to Tasmania, to Ireland, to Tierra del Fuego on dry ground. And that was during the Ice Age, which we believe happened a few hundred years after the flood. The Ice Age was at its height, and that's approximately the same time period as the Tower of Babel incident. Very curious. But the Bible says these are the clans of the sons of Noah. In their genealogies, in their nations, and from these the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. This is a very profound and very interesting thing, because the genealogies, you've read those long lists of names in the Bible, right? It's hard to pronounce names. You know those are all men's names, right? The nations are defined according to the patriarch, that is, the Y chromosome. But if those sons and daughters of Shem, Ham, and Japheth are intermixing, when God separates the nations according to Y chromosome, the daughters of Shem are going to be represented in all the populations. The daughters of Ham are going to be represented in all the populations. This actually is a wonderful, wonderful prediction. Think about this. Who moves around in history more, men or women? Men do. Who goes off to fight wars? And what happens to the women in the city after the city's conquered? Don't say it. Who goes on long trading expeditions? Who has, a woman in every port? Who tends to stay home? The women do. So genetically, we would predict, just based on human nature over time, Y chromosomes would be randomly distributed around the world, and mitochondria would be pretty much in different locations, very unique to each group. But the opposite is true. The Y chromosomes can be pegged to Africa, Europe, Ireland, China, Native America. The mitochondrial lineages are spread around. Why? Because despite human nature, the pattern set up at the Tower of Babel is still in the world today. God separated people according to the Y chromosome. Now we can see that being erased, and one way we see that when we look at European Y chromosomes and European mitochondria, because of the relic of the colonial era, and because it was the men who tended to go off, the women didn't, most of the women stayed behind, the men went to South America, to South Pacific, to other places, and they tended to pick up a local girl and get married. This has happened a lot, and therefore European Y chromosomes are found all over the world. But European mitochondria are not. That's human nature. But even though that has happened, we haven't scrambled this pattern. This is really cool. Now, are you following me here, or is this too much? I see lots of deer in headlight looks. All right. I told you this is hard for me because this is my stuff. It's hard not to talk effusively about random things when I'm so excited about it. Anyway. No, I said this enough. Let's go to the next one. This is a family tree of all the Y chromosomes in the world. This is deliberately depicted this way to give you the impression that we all evolved from monkeys. All the guys on the right are African. That's 1, 2, 3, the 4 on the right. Those are strictly African lineages. On the left is everybody else. There's some Africans, there's the Chinese, the Europeans, the Native. They're all on the left. This looks like humanity originated in Africa, and that's why it's depicted this way. However, here's a chart that I drew myself. That is 1,233 human Y chromosomes. And when you depict it this way, this looks a lot different, doesn't it? This looks like from a central point. Those lines that go way out to the side. On the far over here, this is the pygmies, a very small population, a very strange population in Africa. On the farthest group there, that's the Bushmen that live in the Kalahari Desert. These are very small populations of people who've been struggling in their environment for a long time. And they're the oddballs. You know, in science, we have to be careful of outliers. An outlier is, you're doing a statistical experiment, and it's random. Every once in a while, you might flip heads like 50 times in a row. It's not supposed to happen, but it will happen eventually. And you can't base, hey, every time I flip this coin, it's heads. You can't make that conclusion because the next one might not be heads. Well, here we have some outliers. But if you ignore the outliers, the rest of the world looks clearly like it originated with a single person. And over just a few thousand years, because only a couple of hundred differences here. That's easy to account for in 4,000 years. Men diversified in their family trees. In fact, here's another one I drew. That one is the female lines. That's mitochondria. That central part is mitochondrial Eve. It is clear that humans, from a central small population, just like the Bible predicts. And we can see it in the data. Now, I know that might look complicated to you, but do you get the gist of it? We came from one man and one woman. And the amount of mutations on these two trees is trivial for the biblical age of the earth. If we were a population millions of years old, we could have accumulated a lot more mutations than we actually have. All this to say, we really did come from one population. Here's a quote from a pretty famous geneticist, Luis Quintana-Murci. And he said, I have to define a word, phenotypic. Remember in genetics in high school, phenotype is the way things look. The phenotypic differences are the way one race looks to another. Well, the genes that explain the way different races look between populations only represent a tiny portion of our genome, confirming once again the concept of race from a genetic standpoint has been abolished. Therefore, everything that Charles Darwin wrote about races is rubbish. I wish Hitler knew this. But where do the races come from? Inbreeding. If you think you come from a rich diversity of people, you're lying to yourself. Here's an example from the Bible. That's Terah, Abraham, Sarah, Nahor, and Haran. Look at the family tree between Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. After this many generations, those are on the bottom there, those are the 12 tribes of Israel. They should be about 3% identical to Terah. They're over 20% identical. And about half of that, they'll have, all 12 brothers will have 2 identical copies of those pieces of DNA. So if there's a typical trait like big nose or curly hair or really dark skin or very tall or squeaky voice or whatever it is, whatever gene is found in all the brothers, they're all going to be very similar looking because of inbreeding. Most people in history married someone who grew up less than 10 miles away from where they lived. That's your heritage. Hey cousin, how you doing? All right, cool picture. Give me a second to explain this. Each column is a letter in the genome. But instead of A, T, G, and C, we'll use squares. Red, blue, green, or black. So each column is a letter. Each row is a person. So you just follow along. You see, this is number one, person number one. Here's person number two, person number three. Can you see these big chunks of DNA that are shared amongst many people? You can see that, right? Those stripes. You know what that is? That's a piece of DNA. These two people had the same great-great-great-great-grandfather and don't even know it. Inbreeding. This is the same exact part of the genome found in one African tribe, the Yoruba of Nigeria. Go back, please. Yeah, Europe. You see, under the number 15, there's this purplish stripe with no diversity there. The reason I chose this region is that is the NCR1 gene. On end of chromosome 16, that's the major determiner of the European skin color. And we all have two identical copies. Meaning Europe was settled by a very small group of people. Meanwhile, Africa has maintained a fairly large population size for most of its history. That's really cool. That tells us a lot of things. I'm not trying to do Europeans too much. I'm not trying to be politically correct. It's just kind of fun when you learn stuff like this. So I hope you don't think I'm insulting you too much. Now, how many people are in the world today? Anybody know? Yeah, 7 billion people. If we started with Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their 3 wives 4,500 years ago, can we have 7 billion people today? Actually, yeah. All you have to do is double the population every 150 years. So 150 years after the flood, there are 12 people. 300 years after the flood, there are 24 people. 450 years after the flood, 48 people. 4,500 years after the flood, 7 billion people. Trivial. Math. I love math. If evolution were true, they said there were like a million Homo erectuses alive in Africa for about 1 million years. I think they're missing about 3 trillion bodies. Where are they? All the Homo erectuses ever found could fit in the trunk of a car. It's as if that population never really existed, and it's really mythological. All right, I'm going to end up with this. The state of the genome today. Where are we headed? Granted, we have a curse, right? The curse, which I read earlier. God talking to Adam, because you listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you, and pain is she of all the days of your life. You know this part. The universe is cursed. Well, the genome is part of the universe. Therefore, we should predict that the genome is degenerating. And it is. In fact, you right now, I don't care how old or young you are carrying every possible mutation. Your body generates pretty much every type of cancer every single day. And most of the time, it's fixed. Cancer is something escaping the body's fixing mechanisms. Every one of your cells has about 1 million mutations per day. Most of them are fixed. But happily, we don't inherit. Man, if we were skin cells, we would not have human beings. We would have went extinct a long time ago. The mutation burden would be too great. But we inherit only the reproductive cells. And happily, at least for the female lines, those reproductive cells don't divide. The male line, though, they divide like crazy after puberty. So the older the man is, the more mutations he passes on. But if you average it out, it's about 60 to 100 mutations per generation. That means every generation is more mutant than the generation before. That is the opposite direction that Darwinian evolution requires. We have to be getting rid of those mutations or we will go extinct. And that's an idea called genetic entropy. We are absolutely going extinct. Here's a quote from another geneticist. They looked at, after the human genome was done, they sequenced 20 human genomes. They thought that was a big deal. I analyzed 1,000 genomes project today, and 100,000 genomes project has already been started. There's a massive amount of data out there for people to analyze. But they're looking at 20 human genomes. It says, we summarize different categories of variation in each genome, and in total across all 20 of the genomes. And they found a surprising number of mutations that were predicted to reduce or remove proteins coded by genes. Why were they surprised to find mutations that deleted protein genes? Because, first of all, it takes millions of years to evolve a new gene. How could we lose them? Second of all, if a lot of people are missing genes, that means we're falling apart faster than we're evolving. And again, here's math, here's evolution. The math trumps evolution every time. Too complicated. Let's get to the end here. Everyone's glazing over on me. Okay, look. When someone like Francis Collins says Adam and Eve do not fit the evidence, how do we now respond? You say, wait a minute, go look at that Carter guy, go read his book, go read his articles. Or, if we could remember some details here, first of all the variations found in this room, less a few mutations that are bad. Most all the variation found in this room can easily fit into a single starting couple. We don't need mutation as a source of this diversity. We just have to have God put into Adam a little bit of genetic diversity. That's all. We don't need millions of years. We don't need a common ancestor with chimpanzees. We can explain the origin of races very easily in just a few thousand years. And when we look at the distribution of genes around the world, it really looks like we had a Tower of Babel incident. That's really cool. That's the type of data the Bible would predict. You know, Hebrews 4:12 says, "For the word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing to the division of soul and of spirit, of joints and of marrow, and discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart." My friends, if you are struggling with this subject, if you're having a hard time believing the Bible might be real, I would encourage you to take a good hard look at it and just maybe, the sword of that spirit would split you in half. Because really, you can't believe this without the Holy Spirit changing you. Because if this is true, then God is true. And therefore, God really is the Lord of everything, and we really are accountable to Him. And this is why this is such a difficult field in the sciences, because the scientists know that if that's true, they're accountable to their God. And the unbeliever doesn't want that to be true. As before, I'm going to end with 1 Peter 3:15. In your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. And I hope you didn't discover any snarkiness or snide comments. I tried real hard to get rid of all that kind of an attitude and just present the data as best as I can. Now, what do you do now? You're going to forget 90% of what I've said. You probably already have. That's what the human brain does. I've left you with an impression, but the data, how do you remember some of this stuff? You have to go back and revisit it. So take a look at Creation Magazine. We're going to hand out our Creation Magazine sign-up forms like we didn't do this morning. We'll do it now. Fantastic information here. Here's an article about carbon dating and dating methods. Here's one about climate change, the ice age, how we explain all this environmentalism today. Here's one about species adapting over time as a God-given mechanism. Charles Darwin didn't invent natural selection. No way! That was invented by creationists decades earlier. He just said enough natural selection can lead to the common origin of all species. Adaptation, natural selection, has been part of the creation model for like 80 years before Charles Darwin came on the scene. Here's what a sign-up form looks like. You have to write it doesn't work again. You have to put your name down. You have to put, if you want it for 1 or 3 years, and you have to tear off the little corner coupon and bring it to the tables. All right, guys, you can do that now. Okay. If you do sign up for a 1-year subscription, we're going to give you a free copy of the magazine. We do that because it comes out 4 times a year. We like you to walk away with one. If you sign up for a 3-year subscription, I'll give you a free copy of the magazine. Next. And your choice of a couple of DVDs. You can get The Alternative Creation and Competitive Edge, which I gave this morning. You can get Darwin, The Voyage That Shook the World, which is on the table right next to the magazines. And I'll also give you a copy of a paper sleeve DVD called How Darwin Got It Wrong, 7 Major Points, and it wasn't just about science. If you're interested in this thing, you want to hear it again, well, I've got a lecture on DVD, Mitochondrial Eve and the 3 Daughters of Noah. I gave this for the first time ever in front of 700 people in Australia. That was a lot of fun. They captured it on DVD. But I had another talk I gave at one of our super conferences just a couple of years ago called The High-Tech Cell. This is my favorite lecture I've ever given in my life. And I was so happy that they had TV cameras there because they got it, and they edited it, they put it together in a really fun presentation on how complicated and wildly fun the human genome is, and how it argues against evolution. In fact, Darwin ignored Gregor Mendel when he discovered the laws of genetics. And he was suppressed for more than 60 years before they couldn't ignore him anymore. Genetics has been at war with Darwinism since day one. Is evolution's Achilles' heels? There's an entire chapter in here about genetics. We have lots of things in here about genetic entropy, about human history, and a lot of other fields other than genetics, but I did write the genetics chapter. Here's a book, Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome, and it's a new cover now. It's a little bit different, but it's the same book. Essentially, this is an insider's look into genetics. Now, all the major Darwinists acknowledge that it doesn't work mathematically. But there's no big math, there's no big science in here. In fact, this guy, the author, he paints these brilliant word pictures. In fact, the illustration of the princess and the pea is one of the best illustrations of the difference between genes and the individual upon which natural selection operates. It's brilliant. You have to read the book to see. And now, I imagine there's some creation groupies in here, some junkies maybe, some science nerdy type people like me. Take a look at our Journal of Creation. I don't have any copies with me, but go to creation.com. You can read some back issues and you can sign up for it for yourself. There's some really provocative and profound things that I have read over the years that came out of our Journal of Creation. I am a different person. My faith and my understanding of science is different because of reading what my peers are writing on these subjects. You can do it too. Okay, I'm finished. Let's pray.